And all right. Hello, everyone. Hello, we are live. Please refresh the page. Again, we are live. Please refresh the page. And just a quick request, could you just let us know in the chat when you can see us and hear us? Again, you can just let us know in the chat when you can see us and hear us. So I actually asked this because I've had some bad experiences before the webinars where, it didn't come through correctly, but I'm looking on the play page and it looks like people can see and hear. So I think we're ready to get started. Encore, you want to take it away?
Absolutely. All right. Welcome, everyone. John can see and hear us. Shane, it's great to have you on this show. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little bit intimidated. Normally the roles are reversed. You're in my position, but it's great to have you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Cool. So you're a bit of a star attraction. Most people know who you are, but for the people that do not, can you introduce yourself really quickly?
Oh, I'm terrible at bios. I'm Shane.
Yeah.
Like that's normally the bio that I give people.
Yeah.
Like I'm
Yeah.
just, um, I uh, I run a company called Farnham Street. We help people think better and live better, and we offer books and sort of courses. And I think that's what we're here to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have, we'll kind of start by talking about the course and what it's about, since I have a lot of questions on that, and then we'll kind of go back and talk a little bit about you. But yeah, tell us about the course.
So we put a course on Teachable called Decision by Design, and it's sort of like the skills that you can bring to any decision. So it's not about cognitive biases. It's not about sort of academic theories of what people should do in certain situations, like build out this decision tree and figure out the expected value. It's more about like, what are the behaviors that we can bring to any decision that put us on the path to success? What are the skills that go into any decision, and um, how can we interact with people in our team to get better information, and how can we get better decisions? Because when you think about it, most of our time at work is spent cleaning up poor initial decisions. Either we didn't communicate it properly, or we didn't use the team effectively, or we came up with we started solving the wrong problem. So how do we go about getting better solutions, identify the root problem, and sort of go forward from there? And it's a set of skills that you can learn, but they aren't often taught. And yet the best decision makers in the world tend to bring, they call them different things, but they tend to have the same behaviors around decisions.
Nice. I was seeing in the trailer video that you talked about how, you learned this initially from one of your bosses, and then you kind of found this pattern in other successful people. What's the opposite of this? So before this kind of framework, what are some of the mistakes you think you were making or other people are making?
Well, I worked for an intelligence agency, a 3-letter intelligence agency. And, I started 2 weeks before 9/11.
Yeah.
And, you get rapidly promoted and you end up, in charge of a lot of things when you're really young, but nobody really taught you how to make decisions. I remember walking home one night going, nobody's ever taught me what it means to make a decision. What's a good decision? What's a bad decision? How do I frame this? How do I gain the confidence? And then everybody's coming at you and everybody's telling you different information, so you feel paralyzed. When is enough information enough? How do I determine, should I decide this now or should I wait? And I didn't know, right? And I started this quest sort of when I was in my late 20s. And I've been doing it ever since. I've got to speak to some of the best people in the world. I've studied some of the best people in the world. I've practiced everything I've talked. I've started three successful businesses using all of this stuff. And I think it's just worth sharing with the world. And there's no better time than now during COVID and uncertainty to sort of like share what we've learned with people, to help them through this, to help them make better decisions as a company, preserve optionality for the future, and sort of like set themselves on the right path to success.
Makes sense. I guess so. How would I? So I think I'm like, how would I judge my own decision making ability, right? Like for a lot of people, they sort of think about who is this course for? Because on the surface, yes, everyone needs to make better decisions or so forth. But is there sort of a specific demographic that you think this applies to more so than others?
No, it applies to your professional life and your personal life equally. And it sort of applies at whatever level you're at. Like it adapts to sort of where you are, whether you're just starting in an organization and you want to start establishing the habits and routines that are going to make you successful, or you're looking to take your career to the next level, or you're looking to set the culture in the company around decision making. What does it mean to be a leader? And when we think of leadership, we rarely think of decision making as a component of leadership. And yet decision making is a huge component to what it means to be a good leader. And we tend to ascribe value to our decisions, right? So good people make good decisions. Good leaders make good decisions. Now, that's not true. We result, and we take the result and we use that as our input for what it means to be a good leader. But there are things that we can do, especially at a younger age, or if you're mid-career, that put you on the path to success. And even if you get 1 or 2% better at making decisions, when you map that out over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it makes a huge difference in outcomes and what's available to you, the opportunities you have.
Makes sense. And how, I guess, how do you feel about the role of emotion in decision making? Like, do you think good decisions by definition are like denying emotion, or do you think it's like yeah, how do you feel like emotion plays in?
Not at all. I don't think we need to deny our emotion. I think we have a rational brain, we have an emotional brain, and you can think of these things as a continuum. You're somewhere between emotional and rational. And your goal as a decision maker really is to determine, where am I on that continuum and where should I be? What's the optimal sort of, where do I need to be for this type of decision? But then you also want to have a framework or skills that you bring to the table, or habits that check in with both your rational and emotional selves on every decision. And we have a skill in the course that actually teaches you how to do that. So you can check in with your rational and emotional selves. It doesn't take much time at all, but you're sort of like getting the feel for it. And we've all done this before, right? Like our rational brain, something that would resonate with people. We've all taken hours to craft the perfect email to somebody. We're telling them exactly what we think, and rationally we're entirely correct. We hit send, and then all of a sudden we just want to undo it because our emotional brain is like, what have you done? And so you need an ability to check in with both your head and your heart, and you want them aligned. And when they're not aligned, you want to dive into that. Why aren't they aligned? And that's a moment to pause and reflect before going forward and acting.
That makes sense. We have a question from Joseph in chat, who's like on this topic. I guess it's two questions. One is, how do you learn from your mistakes? Do you have kind of a process there? And how do you make decisions with incomplete information?
Yeah, so learning from your mistakes is really interesting, right? We think learning happens through experience, but learning doesn't actually happen through experience. Experience is a necessary but not sufficient component to learning. Learning happens through reflection. So we have to reflect on the experience, and it can be our experience. It can be a conversation. It can be an experience with somebody else. We can read about it. We can talk to somebody. We can consume experience in a lot of different ways, but the real learning from that experience comes from reflecting. So when you think of it that way, what happens when we reflect? Well, we draw an abstraction, and the abstraction is what we will do next time in this situation. But when you do the reflection, you know when that's likely to work and when it's not likely to work. And that puts you on the path to success, right? Because now you have an abstraction, but you did the work. And most of the information that we consume online is basically abstractions. It's other people telling us what the result of their reflection is, but we don't know when it works and when it doesn't work. So we're sort of like the line cook in the restaurant who follows the recipe, but it doesn't taste right. We blame the recipe, but the real problem is with us, right? We consume something, we don't know how it interacts with each other. We don't know how the ingredients work together. And we don't know that if we just add a little bit more salt or pepper, it'll totally change the flavor and make it better. But the chef knows that. And the chef knows that because the chef has done the work. They've done the reflection. They've done sort of like the hard mental labor of learning from experience. And sorry, what was the second question?
I'll get back to that because that's a really great analogy. So what do you recommend for people? How do they become the chef in your analogy? How do you actually do the work reflecting?
Yeah, so that comes from the analogy comes from Wait But Why. Just to be clear on sourcing here, and Tim's a good friend of mine. He's amazing. Highly recommend you check him out. I think like the work comes from the reflection, and you can't reflect on everything. But often what happens is when we've just had a painful experience, we're sort of feeling it emotionally, and our rational brain is like, we really need to learn from this, but you can't do that because you're emotionally not available. And so what we tell ourselves is, we'll check in with this later, right? We'll come back to this, but we never come back to it because we get busy, we forget about it, and then we don't really learn. But reflection is the key to learning. So you have to ask yourself, what happened? What was the situation? What was my contribution to it? And you have to remove fault from anybody but you. You just have to think about what you controlled in the situation. And maybe you were right, and you just got a bad outcome. And maybe you were wrong, and there's something that you could have done differently next time. And that's where you start updating your sort of abstractions that you have in your mind. And if you think of learning as a loop, you have experience at the top, reflection at the 3 o'clock sort of mark, abstraction at the 6 o'clock mark, and then abstractions lead to actions. Put that at 9 p.m. And then actions lead to experience, right? And so you have this complete loop of learning that you can constantly update about how you're learning. And most of us are just consuming abstractions, and it's the illusion of knowledge. We actually have to do the work, but you can't do the work in everything. So when you haven't done the work, you need to acknowledge that you're really the line cook, and you need to think about things in that way, right? I don't understand why it didn't work, but I'm not going to blame the recipe. I'm going to say, oh, if this is something really important to me, I need to dive into this, and I need to learn more about why it's not working, because this is something critical to my job. It's critical to my life. It's something I want to understand. But reflection is often painful, especially when it's personal, right? Or you've done something that you have to acknowledge to yourself that you haven't contributed in the way that you want to solving the problem, or you messed up, you made a mistake. And what does that mean? What does it mean to make a mistake? What does it mean to acknowledge that I didn't do what I wanted to do? And if given the opportunity, I would do it differently. That's hard on our ego. So reflection is really hard. So guided reflections are, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And there's a few sort of follow-up questions here on the mental model, and doing the work, is the right thing to do. But how do you use a different framework when making decisions in the heat of the moment, when you might not have necessarily the time? Is that when you sort of go back to relying on the abstractions?
Well, sort of most decisions don't actually, most decisions that matter don't actually have to be made in the heat of the moment. There's very few decisions that have to be made in that. And I think sort of like designing your skills and behaviors around one or two decisions is not the way to go about it. Most decisions you can take 24 to 72 hours to make. And then the other decisions that take more than 72 hours, if there's no need to make them, why would you make them? Because the source of all bad decisions is sort of information that you didn't know at the time you made a decision. So if you don't have to make the decision, the goal with any decision is to wait to the last possible minute. And the last possible minute you can sort of define as options are going away, or something's happening, and you're starting to lose financial resources. You're losing credibility with your team. There's something happening that's motivating that decision. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make, but most decisions can be made, fairly quickly. The problem is most of us take like, oh, I want a new TV, and we'll agonize over it for weeks or months. And so we'll do all the research on these decisions, and we'll start, this little technical detail. And, after 72 hours, you're not really acquiring any more information, but you're consuming your time, your mental energy, but you're also not waiting to the last possible minute. So what happens is you get in this middle, and I call it the messy middle, or you can call it sort of like spinning in the middle. And then you have this decision in your brain, and it's lingering, and your brain is always thinking about it, right? You're always thinking about this TV. So you pop up, sort of Amazon, you do a review comparison, and you're just always like consuming cycles in your head. And then what happens is eventually you get frustrated because you have 100 of these little decisions in your head that you feel like you have to make. So you make a decision on the spot, and you make a suboptimal decision, or you make the decision you would have made at 72 hours or 24 hours or whatever. But it consumed a whole bunch of time and resources in the meantime. And if there's no reason to make that, just get it out of your head, and you want to be seen as decisive and not indecisive. So your ego also comes into play with how you feel about yourself about making these decisions. And just to be clear, none of the ideas that we talk about in the course are my ideas. They're ideas that I've learned from other people over the course of my career, or conversations that I've had with other people, or just sort of like learning from books. But they all work in the real world. And it's really fascinating to think about things through a different lens. And I think that even if one behavior is something that you can adapt to your sort of process at work, it's going to be exponentially valuable the longer you use it.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. I think Perry has a question on the course specifically, in terms of, what is the difference between the course versus the free training on mental models?
Yeah, so we don't actually talk about mental models at all in the the course inside. We're going to come out with a course next year on mental models, and we'll have 109 videos in that course, and they'll be 5 to 8 minutes each. And that'll be sort of like the university education you wish you would have had. But it's also, those are all on the books that we're producing. And so like, this isn't about mental models. This is about skills, habits, routines that you can bring to any problem that'll help you solve it. So yeah, not about mental models really. Mental models help you sort of evaluate between different options and play things into the future. This is more behavioral based, skill based, routine based for things that you want to bring to any decision that you're facing, and recognizing how to get the best information out of people. It's very counterintuitive how to use a team to make decisions, and how to get information from the team versus getting information from individuals is a very different process.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. A question, interesting question from Saul saying, "Hi Shane, how would you guide someone to the decision of whether or not to buy the course?"
Oh, that's interesting. Like we don't do anything sort of like salesy or sleazy on
Yeah,
that. So if you're
yeah,
on the fence, don't buy it.
yeah,
I mean, you can always come in at a later date.
yeah,
We're releasing it now. It's sort of, I wouldn't say it's a beta version, but we're sort of getting it out the door. There'll be a few kinks in getting this
yeah.
out. But when we're closing it Friday at 11:59 p.m. PST, and then when we open it again, either in September or January next year, it'll be a higher price point, and it'll sort of be a different inside. But the goal is to make this the #1 resource for decision making. You can call it decision school. We call it decision by design because you're designing the behaviors that you choose to bring to any sort of decision. And the goal is just to have one place where I wanted to go. I ended up doing an MBA. My MBA was $100,000, and I still didn't learn how to make decisions. So I wasted time and money, and I learned a lot through costly trial and error. And I'm hoping that I can save other people some of that, even if it's just 1 or 2 things that you learned out of the course that help you. But
Cool.
if you're on the fence, bottom line,
Don't buy it.
don't buy it, right? Like
Very,
if you're not fully in or you're not fully decided, why decide now? You don't have to decide now. You're going to lose out on optionality a little bit because what's going to happen is it'll be a higher price, but you can defer.
yeah, it's very, very Canadian of you. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're on the fence, just don't buy the product.
I mean, my inclination was to apologize that you were on the fence, but
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that would be really Canadian.
So Teachable, when we talk about an online course, we talk about a transformation, right? Like for us, a good online course is like one sort of very specific outcome that someone taking the course gets. In your mind, what is that like one specific outcome you would want a student to have from this course?
I want you to save time, right? Because if you think about how you spend your time at work, again, going back to this, most of your time is spent cleaning up poor initial decisions. And if you don't want to feel the anxiety, the stress, the franticness that comes with that, you don't want to feel the analysis paralysis as you start to lose confidence because you're overwhelmed, and you don't want to rush through decisions, the best thing you can do is slow down for a second and make better initial decisions. And as time plays out, even if they're slightly better, you'll start saving time. But that time can be invested in learning and developing. It can be invested in growing your responsibilities at work. And more importantly, it's peace of mind, right? So you go to bed at night knowing that you made the best decision possible with the information you had, and knowing that every decision, like there's no perfect decision. There's no such thing as a perfect decision. What you want to do is you want to pick the best option available when you have to pick. And if you don't have to pick, you want to preserve as many options as you have. Why choose, right? But you don't want to prepare for one particular future. You want to prepare for the broadest range of possible futures. For example, if you told me last year at this time that this year I would be the principal of an online school for my kids, I would be at home in my underwear most days and nobody would know, and I would be, locked in my house, I would say you're crazy. That, like, who would prepare for that? But you can, right? And preparing for that means you have extra money lying around. You don't optimize for the moment. And I think one of the things that gets people in trouble is they want to be efficient over effective. So efficient looks like, what's the best thing for me to do to maximize the returns if the world looks the way that it looked today? What would be the best thing to do going forward? And that gets us caught up because efficient is fragile. What happens is we optimize for today, but when the environment changes, things change, right? So efficient is being fully invested at all times. Effective is I have a savings. So if something happens in the future that's unanticipated, I not only can survive, but I can thrive. I can take advantage of chaos. I can take advantage of opportunity that's presented to me, and I can make the future easier through that.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. There's a question from Benny about whether you should spend, like, the overall question is, should you spend more time on a decision the bigger it is? But Benny's question is there a correlation between time spent on the decision and quality of outcome? That's Benny's question. My interpretation from what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the length of time is less about the longer a time makes a better decision. It just buys you optionality. You know more about the world, the kind of more you delay it. How would you say, how do you think time plays in?
You can put decisions on a matrix, right? Between consequential and inconsequential and irreversible and reversible. And the only decisions that you really want to think about with a lot of rigor and process is sort of irreversible, high consequence decisions. Those are the decisions where you do want to take your time. You want to slow down. You want to make sure you have buy-in. But all the other decisions are really different decisions, right? Because even if you can reverse them, or they're low consequence and they're easily reversible, and if they're difficult to reverse, they're still sort of low consequence. And so what you want to do is, if you're leading a team, you want to delegate as many of those decisions as possible to build up high judgment individuals in your team. You want to allow people to make decisions. You want to allow people to make mistakes. You want to focus on the ones that are just, you can't actually sort of reverse easily. And you do want to take your time for those decisions, but almost all other decisions can be made in 24 to, 72 hours.
Yep.
And you have to decide the pace of decision-making, and you have to decide the culture, right? Are we trying to build up high performance, high functioning, high judgment individuals, or are we trying to make me the bottleneck? And if I want to be the bottleneck, one of the mistakes that team leaders often make is sort of like, they see themselves as the bottleneck, but they think that's a good thing, right? Everybody needs me in order to make a decision. That's a terrible thing. When you think about it organizationally, like if you were your boss, you wouldn't want that, but you feel good about it because everybody's coming to you looking for information, or what would you do? And you have to take the time to educate people and develop the high judgment on your team so that people can make decisions without you. And when people can make decisions without you, your velocity as an organization and a team really ramps up, because they don't need you to make decisions, and they know which type of decisions they need to check in with you on. So yeah, there are certain decisions where you want to slow down, you want to get it right, or at least reasonably right, or find out what information that you can acquire at a relatively little cost if you have to make the decision, or you want to keep all those options open. But there's other decisions you want to make right away, and you want to go fast, and you want to break things, and things are going to break and people are going to make mistakes, but that's how we actually develop judgment in decision making. But then you have to sit down with that person and you have to reflect, right? Going back to the discussion about how we learn. So you have to reflect on, what was your thought process? What was the data that you saw available? How did you think about that data? And then you have to coach people through that if you want to develop better judgment in people. And you'll actually get better judgment as you coach people through, because they'll see things that you don't see that are relevant. And that's sort of like how you build up high judgment teams.
Awesome. On a personal note, what's been sort of the most difficult decision you've ever made? This question came from Twitter.
Oh yeah, like leaving the government was a really difficult decision for me, right? So I had an amazing job. I worked for a 3-letter agency. It was the most incredible job in the world, and I got to work with some of the most brilliant people in the world. But ultimately, I think I just wanted to do my own thing. But that's not easy, right? You're walking away from a well-paying job that's guaranteed. You get a pension. You have a lot of healthcare benefits, even in Canada. I mean, and then walking away from that it's not an easy decision. But ultimately, you sort of have to live life. I sort of think of life as living backwards, right? And if you think about fast forward to when you're 90, and what happens when you're 90? Well, you're sitting on a park bench, close your eyes for a second. Everybody can do this as we're talking about it. So close your eyes for a second. You're 90 years old. Imagine you're sitting on a park bench. What do you imagine your life look like? What do people who care about you say? What do people say about you? What did you do? What do you regret? And then when you start thinking about it backwards, you change your perspective. So no longer are you looking forward to the next day or week or month. Now you're starting to look at my body of work. What is it that I want to accomplish? Do I want to be a great father? Do I want to be a great partner? Do I want to be a great son? What does it mean to be those things? And am I those things right now? Or can I be doing better at those things? Am I making time for the people I love? And am I living a life that's true to myself? Or am I living a life that's playing to somebody else's scorecard? And somebody else's scorecard is, if for me, I was in government, I had this job and everybody kept reinforcing how amazing it was. And I had this great career and it was, a high level in the organization. But ultimately that was somebody else's scorecard. That was what was valuable to them. And I loved it. And I loved my experience and I loved my time there. And I loved the world-class people I got to work with. But ultimately, I wanted to do something different, and I have to live a life true to me, or I will regret that at the end of my life.
That's awesome. And when you were making that decision, you said it was a hard decision. Like, talk me through what it was like. Like, how long did it take? Like, when did the idea first kind of plant itself? Yeah. What was your process?
Well, sort of like, I didn't make the decision black or white, right? The idea planted itself in circumstances I won't sort of like divulge here, but you sort of start thinking about it. And then instead of just quitting, because I think that would have been irrational, right? Is just leaving this high paying, high profile job to sort of like start something on a whim. You can start gathering information. Well, can I make a career out of what else I want to do? Can I gather information about that, what that would mean? Can I start selling advertising on the website? Can I gather income? Can I get proof that if I left, I'm not going to be in dire straits? And so it took about a year and a half to sort of like acquire that. But for that year and a half, I was going home at night, like I was working, I don't know, 8 to 10 hours a day. And I would go home and I would have dinner with my kids. And sort of after that, I would go back to work, right? Because I want to see if I can make a go of this. But that sort of de-risked it to a lot of extent, right? And we often think about like, oh, I want to switch careers. And so we do it on a whim, but really we could gather information for really low costs that would allow us to do that. We can trail somebody, we can go back to school and we can learn more about what we want to do. Or if you think about a lot of people moving to a city, that's a high cost effort. It's reversible, but it's expensive to reverse. But you could just Airbnb a place for a week and live there and see what the vibe is like and see what it feels like. And so there's all sorts of little things that we can do to acquire information to sort of like de-risk the decision. Again, going back to decisions, if you think of bad decisions, the reason we make bad decisions is something we didn't know at the time. So if you can start identifying the information that would help you make a better decision, you can often acquire it for very little cost.
Makes sense. Who do you look up to as a thinker? I mean, obviously, a lot of people here in chat look up to you, so they're curious. Who does Shane look up to?
I look up to, well, I think like there's a lot of value to be found in everybody, right? I don't want to sort of name drop people because I think like I'm going to get so many texts after this going like, why didn't you say me? But I think, you can learn from everybody. And this is an interesting sort of aside, right? We all want to hear the names we recognize because we feel good if they're our hero too. And we'll be like, oh, like, you're just confirming what I already believe. But I think at the end of the day, the real people you can learn the most from are people that you don't necessarily think you can learn anything from, right? Because you can learn something from everybody. I play this game with my kids where it's like you're a detective and your goal is to learn something from everybody that you encounter. Everybody thinks differently about a solution. Everybody thinks differently about a problem. Everybody sees everything through a slightly different lens. And your job is to sort of uncover, do they have a better view of the world than I do? And I think, I really respect, if you want to name, I really respect Charlie Munger and the way he thinks about problems. I really expect his irreverence. Nassim Taleb is another one who I don't always agree with, but I have a lot of respect for the way he thinks. And I think that, it's just hard to think out loud in public. And often we expect people to be faultless too. And one of the reasons people don't think more out loud in public, which we would all benefit from if we all just sort of put our stuff out there, is sort of like the internet culture and the backlash that we get if we're wrong. So if you're somebody like Nassim Taleb and you put out 99 things that are 100% true, but you put out one thing that is like not true, you just get all of this backlash and anger. And it's sort of like people use it to justify what they already think. And I think we could just, if we could eliminate that and just encourage people to think out loud and be, responsive and sort of handle that with care and empathy, we would get a lot more public thinking. And I think we would benefit a lot more from seeing how other people think. But if we go back to the learning again, right? If you're trying to learn through a conversation with somebody else, if you get nothing out of this webinar that we're doing, if you're trying to learn from somebody else and you're having a conversation with them, you want to ask them questions, not what they would do or what they did. You want to ask them how they thought about it. What you're really trying to uncover is their reflection. So they had an experience, but what you're trying to uncover and digest is like, how did you think about that experience? What were the key variables that you identified within that experience? How did those variables interact? What did you learn? What were your assumptions? What proved correct? What didn't prove correct? You don't want to ask people what they would do. That sounds like really easy. And what would you do if you were in
Descriptive.
my situation? And often you get a valuable answer, and you get a valuable answer because of relativity. So if we go to mental models, we all learned this when we were in probably high school physics, right? If you're standing on a train with a ball that's moving 60 miles an hour and somebody says, how fast is the ball moving? Well, it depends on your perspective. If you're on the train and you're holding the ball, it's not moving at all. But if you're watching the train go by, it's moving 60 miles an hour. And if you're on the sun, it's moving like 18,000 miles an hour or whatever. We're moving around the sun. So your vantage point to any problem shapes what you see. And I think that what we're really trying to do is uncover people who are close to the problem, uncover what they thought about and how they thought about it. And that'll help us moving forward.
Awesome. Um, what's next for you over the next few years, right? You talked about your body of work when you look back on your life. Um, what do you think of, like, what do you want to achieve in the next 10 years? And not just, this is not just professionally, is it like personal, like just like broadly, what would make the next decade sort of things you'd look back on and feel good about it?
Well, I think we're sort of working to put a dent. I mean, this is not a problem we can solve, but equalizing opportunity in the world. I don't believe in equal outcomes, but I do believe in equal opportunity. And I am incredibly fortunate to have been born in what I consider to be one of the greatest countries in the world, Canada. And I benefited from a world-class education that was free, great public healthcare system, amazing infrastructure. And I've never, my parents didn't make a ton of money, but I never had to worry about food. I never had to worry about a lot of things that other people have to worry about. And so I feel very privileged to be sort of in the situation that I'm in. And if there's anything that we can do to get back to the world. And so the mental models project that we have going on is exactly this, right? We want to make a university 101 education available to everybody in the world for free. And so everything we're doing around that is with the goal of, we're funding it as we go, but the goal is to release it when we're free. So we tell people, like, all the books, the content in the books, you might buy this beautiful hardcover book that we have, but that content will eventually be free on the web. And what we want to do with that is make it accessible to anybody in the world, thanks to the internet, at any time. And so if you have the desire to learn, you have access to the same information as everybody else. You don't need to go to university anymore to get that. And you can get this broad, we're not trying to be specific. We're not trying to teach you how to code. We're not trying to teach you to be a chemist, but we are trying to give you, like, what are the basic ideas of the world that are relatively unchanging or invariant over time, and how can we go about learning them and applying them to our life?
Is that a personal mission, a professional mission, or are they both the same to you?
I mean, work and life are the same thing to me, right?
Yeah.
Like I have,
Yeah.
and this causes problems for other people
Yeah.
because a lot of people
Yeah.
are like, it's 5 o'clock, I turn off my brain and my
Yeah.
work. And for me, it's very different, right? I love what I do every day. I feel like I don't work at all in a lot of ways. If you define work as doing something I don't want to do, occasionally I interact with lawyers or accountants, but generally speaking, work for me is fun. It's pleasurable. I work with an amazing team of people who make me look better than I am, and I get to work with amazing companies like Teachable. And I don't know, like, it's just like, it's a very good place to be, and it's a very happy place when you can choose to work with people that you love and admire. And yeah, I think that's a great place.
Which leads me to the final question. We're a little bit over time, but again, this came in via Twitter too, and it's the existential question of all. But are you happy, Shane?
I'm totally happy, man. Like,
Yeah.
I decided long ago that, well, I'm probably not going to die tomorrow. I want to live my life in a way that I won't have any regrets about going after my dreams, about spending time with my kids, or doing what's important to me. But to do that, you have to really identify what's important to you. And that's a lot of introspection on people. And so often we don't want to do that. We want to pull out our phone. We want to be distracted because thinking is hard. Identifying the one thing that's most important to you is hard. And then making choices around that thing is hard too, right? We're constantly making trade-offs. We often think that oh, I won't go home tonight and spend time with my kids, but what I'll do is next week I'll make it up. But next week's just as busy. And then when you can make it up, your kids are grown and they're older and you can't repair that relationship. And so, again, I'm super fortunate that I have a job that's very flexible and I can work around a lot of those things. But ultimately, it comes down to identifying what's important to you and living a life true to that, not letting somebody else identify happiness for you. You have to identify happiness for yourself. And I think a component of happiness that most people miss is giving back to the community or the world and feeling like you're a part of something larger than yourself, be it a company or a community or just making the world a better place. And I think we all need that. I don't think a lot of people think about that.
That makes sense. Thanks for sharing that. Really appreciate you coming and joining us today. Since you're too nice to say it, I'll tell everyone else. I recommend buying Shane's course. It's live till tomorrow at midnight. But again, as Shane points out, it'll be live again, but probably not for a few months. At
And
Teachable,
at a higher price.
And at a higher price. There we go. Yeah, at Teachable, we're big fans, and I'm very glad to all of you who've joined us today. Thanks for tuning in.
Well, thanks for having me. Take care.